Karoline Leavitt didn't just spar with Whoopi Goldberg on The View. She ignited a war that's shaking the leftist media to its core, and I've got the inside scoop to prove it. Crisis mode. Red lights slash through the control room. The View studio reeks of panic, a suffocating mix of perfume, sweat, and something else. Fear. An ABC insider. Anonymous. A post on Twitter. Karoline didn't just embarrass Whoopi, she gutted her, and they didn't stop it. This isn't a fluke, folks. It's a calculated clash. The stench of hypocrisy is thick in the air. And here's how it happened. Cut to the studio. Whoopi, perched on her throne of smugness, leans forward. The crowd hums, a restless sea of claps and whispers. Her voice cuts through, sharp as a rusty blade. Without wokeness, you wouldn't even have this job, honey. The jab lands heavy, dripping with condescension. Karoline, all 27 years of her, doesn't flinch. Her chair stays still, her lips curl slow, a predator sizing up prey. Really? She fires back, voice smooth as steel. Let's talk facts. Taxpayers shelled out millions for your woke fantasies. Gender studies in Guatemala, Sesame Street propaganda abroad. That's not fairness. That's theft. The studio freezes. A gasp ripples through the crowd. Then silence, thick, suffocating. Joy Behar shifts in her seat, the leather squeaking like a plea for escape. Whoopi's eyes dart, searching for a lifeline. Her fingers grip the table edge, knuckles pale against the dark wood. She opens her mouth. Well, you know, you just blab. But it's a whimper, not a roar. Karoline's words hang like smoke, curling around the room, choking out the leftist gospel The View has preached for years. The audience senses it. The Queen's crown is slipping. Here's the kicker. My source whispers, voice low, urgent. ABC knew Whoopi'd take a swing. They didn't expect Karoline to hit back like a freight train. The control room buzzes, headsets clatter, producers scramble. Did they underestimate her? Or, hear me out, did they want this? Trump's victory still stings, and ABC's desperate to look fair in 2025. What better way than to let their loudest leftist stumble live on air? The scent of betrayal wafts through the studio vents, cold, metallic, final. Karoline stands tall, a beacon in the chaos. Her suit gleams under the lights, sharp as truth itself. Whoopi slumps, a shadow of the titan she once was. The crowd murmurs, a tide turning. One truth cuts deeper than applause. Power doesn't bow to noise, it bows to reality. But who lit this fuse? Was it Trump sending his sharpest soldier to gut the media beast? Or is ABC playing a darker game? Next time, we're diving deeper. Whoopi's not done yet. She's gearing up to strike back. Will her claws draw blood or just scratch the surface? Tune in, because this war's only begun. ABC wasn't stopping it. That's what sent the first jolt of fear crawling down Whoopi's spine. The moment stretched too long, the silence pressing too heavy. She'd played this game before. Throw out a smug remark, let the audience do the rest. But tonight, the script wasn't working. Karoline hadn't stammered, hadn't fumbled, hadn't given her the easy victory. And ABC? They weren't cutting to commercial, weren't feeding her the lifeline she needed. Whoopi adjusted in her chair, shoulders squaring. She could feel the tension, a weight pressing from all sides. The audience, usually a symphony of agreeable nods and obedient applause, sat tight-lipped, unsure of what to do with the shift in power. That had never happened before. Not to her, not on this stage. She needed to turn it back, now. She let out a laugh, forced and hollow, the kind meant to dismiss. "Oh, come on," she said, waving a hand like the conversation wasn't worth her time. But her voice, there was something in it, a crack. Then she lunged. "You're just a Trump puppet." She said it sharp, firm, as if saying it made it true. The crowd latched on, an instinctive reflex, applause breaking like a dam barely holding back the flood. This was the moment, the counterstrike, the swing that would put the conservative girl back in her place, except it didn't. Karoline didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't even blink. She smiled, slow, measured, like someone watching a desperate opponent throw their last punch. A puppet? She echoed, voice steady as stone. Puppets don't bring facts. Puppets don't think for themselves. And they definitely don't sit across from you and refuse to back down. Whoopi's smirk twitched. The audience, still riding the high of their own cheers, felt it too. Something was off. Karoline leaned forward, voice cutting through the noise like a razor. But you know who does pull strings? The billionaires funding the very wokeness you defend. You think you're speaking for the people, Whoopi? How much of that money ever makes it to the working class? To the single moms choosing between gas and groceries while you sell them equity like it's a luxury brand? A shift. A breath held too long. Joy Behar shifted, hands gripping the table, her mouth open. But she didn't jump in. Couldn't. Whoopi's lips parted, then pressed shut. The silence was worse than a direct hit. The control room had stopped talking. Someone was waiting for the cue, the frantic, go to break, that always came when the conversation veered too close to dangerous. But the call wasn't coming, because ABC was watching too. Watching Whoopi lose. Watching Karoline stand taller. Watching the audience realize that maybe, just maybe, things weren't as simple as they'd been told. Whoopi's hands curled into fists, but there was nowhere to swing. ABC wasn't stopping it. And that's when she knew. She was alone. Whoopi wouldn't go down quietly. That much was clear. Her breath was shallow, controlled, eyes darting. Not at Karoline, not at the audience, but toward the control room. Looking for a signal, an out, a lifeline. Nothing. ABC wasn't stepping in. The audience, always quick to roar with approval, sat tight-lipped, unsure of whether to cheer or wait. The rhythm had changed, the playbook had failed. She reset, straightened her shoulders, forced a laugh. Louder this time, like she could drown out the moment hanging between them. "Oh, honey," she said, her tone dipping into something almost condescending, but not quite landing. "You don't get it, do you? Women like me, we fought for you. We busted our asses so you could even sit at this table." Karoline tilted her head, like she was listening to something distant, something faint. Then she exhaled, soft, almost amused. "Whoopi," she said, voice even, "you didn't fight for me. You fought for control." The silence snapped tight. The panel, Joy, Sunny, shifted, uncomfortable, caught between loyalty and the feeling that something irreversible was happening. "You want credit," Karoline continued, "for breaking barriers, for paving the way. But now that women like me don't follow your rules, don't bow to your ideology, suddenly we're the problem?" Whoopi opened her mouth, but Karoline kept going, voice never rising, never wavering. "You say you fought for equality, but what you really fought for was the power to decide who gets a seat at the table. And now that we've walked in on our own, you can't stand it." Whoopi's fingers curled into the table. The audience wasn't moving, not even a shuffle. Karoline leaned back, unshaken. It was never about lifting people up, was it? It was always about keeping the right people down. Whoopi knew the moment was slipping. She had to break it, had to take back control. And she did the only thing she could. She laughed, loud, forced, hollow. A sound meant to shatter tension, to reset the board. But no one else was laughing. The air didn't move, because the truth was hanging too thick, settling in, refusing to be brushed aside. In the control room, a producer muttered into a headset. Someone finally was giving the signal. Cut, go to break, pull the plug before the wreckage became permanent. But it already was. Whoopi could feel it. This wasn't just one bad moment. This was a crack in the foundation. And for the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't sure if The View could survive it. The show cut to commercial, but the damage was already done. The silence hadn't just filled the studio, it had seeped into the walls, into the cameras, into the very bones of The View. Producers scrambled behind the scenes, muttering into headsets, flipping through segment notes, trying to salvage what was left. The audience sat stiff, shifting in their seats as if realizing, maybe for the first time, that the script wasn't holding. Whoopi sat still, fingers pressed against the smooth surface of the table, shoulders tense. She didn't look at Karoline. She didn't look at Joy. She was calculating. Backstage, an ABC executive was already on the phone. A source inside the network later revealed the conversation. This was not supposed to happen. The plan had been simple. Bring Karoline in, let Whoopi dominate, let the audience have their catharsis, and move on. But the moment had gotten away from them. Whoopi hadn't crushed Karoline. She'd been exposed by her. And now, ABC had a problem. The commercial break dragged, but time wasn't healing the wound. When the cameras flashed back on, Whoopi forced a smile. It didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said, voice dipped in forced amusement, "that was lively." A few chuckles flickered through the crowd, weak, unsteady. It wasn't enough. The atmosphere hadn't reset. The spell had broken. Karoline sat poised, unbothered, her presence still hanging over the conversation like a shadow. She wasn't in a rush to speak. She didn't need to be. The damage had been done, and she knew it. Whoopi inhaled, shifting, trying again. "Let's be honest here," she said, her voice smoothing out, regaining a bit of its usual command. She gestured vaguely, "this whole idea that wokeness is some great evil, it's nonsense. It's fear-mongering. And you, young lady, you've been sent here to peddle it." The last sentence had bite, had venom. It was meant to put Karoline back in her place. Karoline tilted her head, as if considering. Then she laughed, just once, short and sharp, the sound of a chess movie landing perfectly on the board. "With all due respect," she said, voice even, "if wokeness was just about fairness, you wouldn't need to silence people who question it." Whoopi's jaw tensed. Karoline kept going. "If it's just about equality, why is the conversation always one-sided? Why is dissent treated like a crime? Maybe that's why people are done listening." The air in the studio thickened again. Whoopi wasn't used to being the one defending, the one scrambling to maintain control. In the control room, someone muttered, "End the segment early." Too late, because now the audience wasn't just watching Karoline. They were listening to her. Inside ABC's headquarters, the tension had reached a boiling point. The control room had been whispering into headsets, waiting for a cue that never came. The producers had a decision to make: save Whoopi or let the moment burn. And they let it burn. This wasn't just a bad segment. It was a calculated silence. A source inside ABC later revealed they knew Whoopi would react emotionally. They knew she'd go too far, and they let her. They didn't cut her off. They didn't rescue her, almost like they wanted this. Because here's the truth, ABC didn't just lose control of the moment, they gave it up. For years, The View had been an untouchable fortress for the left. The format was always the same. A conservative guest walks in, the hosts pile on, the audience cheers, and the segment moves on. But this time, it wasn't going that way, and ABC wasn't stepping in to fix it. Why? Because they had bigger problems. For months, executives at ABC had been under pressure. Ever since Trump's re-election, something had shifted. Sponsors were nervous, viewers were tuning out, and the network, once a proud mouthpiece for the left, was suddenly being forced to justify its own survival. Disney had been watching. A second source leaked the internal discussions. They were already having talks about rebalancing the show, about reaching a broader audience, about reassessing their brand. Translation? They were worried. The View had become a liability, and Whoopi, she was its biggest problem. Look at the way the segment unfolded. When Karoline first pushed back, Whoopi looked to the control room. She was waiting for the usual cues, the safety net, the backup plan, but nothing came. She went on the defensive. She threw out the Trump puppet attack, but this time, the audience didn't react the way they were supposed to. And then, the moment that changed everything, Karoline dismantled her. It was never about lifting people up, was it? It was always about keeping the right people down. And ABC let it air. No interruption, no commercial break, no desperate attempt to save face. Why? Because maybe, just maybe, ABC was already moving on. A call had gone out, not to the control room, but to Disney's upper management. A leaked email confirmed what some at ABC had already suspected. If The View becomes too toxic, we need contingency plans, a shift in messaging, a transition to something more sustainable. ABC wasn't just dealing with one bad moment. They were testing the waters for something bigger, a full-scale rebrand. And Whoopi, she wasn't part of it. She sat there, fingers gripping the table, trying to salvage her authority, trying to hold on to the power that had always been hers. But something was wrong. The producers weren't jumping in. The segment wasn't being redirected. She was losing, and no one was stopping it. Whoopi Goldberg, the face of The View, the queen of daytime television, was realizing in real time that she might not be untouchable anymore. And she wasn't wrong, because somewhere in an ABC boardroom, someone had just made a decision. Maybe it's time for The View to move on. Maybe it was time to move on from Whoopi. The emails had already started circulating, not among the producers scrambling inside The View's control room, not among the hosts shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but higher up, at Disney, at ABC's corporate offices, where the real decisions were made. The meeting notes from earlier in the week suddenly carried a different weight. A source inside the network later leaked a chilling detail. They were already having conversations about what happens when Whoopi becomes too much of a liability. The segment with Karoline? It just sped up the process. Whoopi didn't know it yet, but the people who had built her up, the executives who had defended her time and time again, were already thinking about what comes next. She sat at the table, hands still pressed against the surface, her breath just a little too controlled, her eyes flicking. Not toward Karoline anymore, but toward Joy, toward the teleprompter, toward the cameras that had witnessed every second of her unraveling. She needed an out, but no one was giving it to her. No producer stepped in with a quick wrap-up cue. No off-screen voice redirected the conversation. She was still on the battlefield, and she was alone. Across from her, Karoline hadn't moved. She was still sitting there, still watching, still waiting. She didn't need to say another word. She had already won. The audience wasn't reacting the way they were supposed to. The usual rhythm, Whoopi's snarky remark, the crowd's laughter, the validation, it was broken. The applause had been uncertain, hesitant, and now, nothing. A void. Because for the first time in a long time, the people sitting in those chairs weren't just watching the debate, they were thinking about it. And in the silence, something else was happening. Questions were forming. Was Karoline right? Had they been told what to think for too long? Had The View, the show that built itself on the idea of being for the people, actually been controlling them this whole time? Inside Disney's headquarters, those same questions were being asked. The internal debate wasn't about Whoopi's politics. It wasn't even about Karoline's victory. It was about survival. The network's numbers were slipping. The corporate sponsors had been whispering about the need for a shift. Something fresher, something more balanced, something that didn't feel like it was trapped in a political echo chamber. The calls that went out that night weren't about if change was coming, but how fast they could make it happen without causing a PR disaster. Whoopi was still on screen, still talking, still fighting to claw back control. But the decision had already been made. Not by her, not by Karoline, by the people who actually ran the show. And in that moment, she might not have realized it yet, but her fate was no longer in her hands. Whoopi left the stage before the applause had even fully died down, walking past interns who wouldn't meet her gaze, past crew members whispering behind their clipboards. She could feel it now, the change, the shift, that unmistakable air of something crumbling beneath her feet. Inside her dressing room, her phone was already blowing up. Calls from her team, calls from executives, calls from voices she had once trusted. She didn't answer. Not yet. Because for the first time in decades, she wasn't sure if she still had the power to fix it. By the time the first headlines hit, it was too late. Whoopi humiliated on live TV, The View's meltdown, ABC executives in crisis mode after Goldberg's on-air collapse. And the worst one, the one she had feared the most, is The View's reign finally over? The network's top brass held an emergency meeting that afternoon, scrambling to get ahead of the story. One executive put it bluntly, "We don't just have a Whoopi problem, we have a brand problem." Ratings had been sliding for months. The audience wasn't just shifting, they were leaving. Sponsors were asking questions they had never dared to ask before. Was The View still worth the investment? Was Whoopi? Behind closed doors, the talk was getting serious. What happens if she's gone? Who replaces her? How do we do this without making it look like we caved? The official statement would be neutral, carefully worded, something about assessing the future direction of the show. But behind the scenes, the knives were already out. The same executives who had defended Whoopi for years were now weighing the cost of keeping her. And in the days that followed, as Karoline's clips dominated the internet, as conservative media hailed her takedown as a cultural turning point, Whoopi was left with a question she had never had to ask before. Had she just become expendable? The storm outside was growing, but Karoline Leavitt, she was standing right in the center of it, calm, collected, completely unfazed. While ABC scrambled to do damage control and Whoopi Goldberg fought to hold on to what little authority she had left, Karoline was doing something far more dangerous. She wasn't just winning the moment. She was owning the narrative. The clips had spread like wildfire. Millions of views, thousands of comments, not just from conservatives, not just from MAGA loyalists, but from regular Americans. People who had never questioned The View before, people who had accepted the show as just another piece of daytime television. But now, they were watching with different eyes. They were asking questions they'd never thought to ask. And Karoline? She saw the opening. The very next day, she doubled down. She wasn't retreating, wasn't letting the media spin the event into another conservatives get shut down on national TV moment. Instead, she went on offense. Her posts dissected The View's hypocrisy in real time. The mainstream networks ignored it at first, pretending the moment had never happened. But they couldn't hold the line for long. By the time she walked into the press briefing room at the White House, the reporters were already waiting. They wanted a reaction. They wanted a carefully prepared response, a polished deflection, something they could easily dismiss. But Karoline? She gave them something else. She stepped to the podium, let the cameras roll, and with the same controlled composure that had sent Whoopi Goldberg into freefall, she said, "It's interesting, isn't it? The same people who spent years preaching about inclusivity, about fairness, about lifting voices, the moment someone challenges them, they panic. The moment someone refuses to fall in line, they shut down." A pause, and then, with the same calm certainty that had left an entire studio stunned into silence, she delivered the final blow. The View isn't a debate show, it's a controlled performance. And for the first time, the script didn't work. The room held its breath. Somewhere inside ABC, another emergency meeting was being called. Somewhere inside Disney, another executive was wondering if they were about to lose control of more than just a talk show. Because Karoline wasn't just a guest who held her ground, she was a new kind of problem, one they weren't prepared to handle. The headlines were relentless. Whoopi's meltdown on live TV, ABC in full-blown crisis mode, The View's future in jeopardy. And worse, the conversations weren't just happening in conservative circles anymore. They were everywhere. Sponsors had started asking questions. Was this show still worth the investment? The network had spent years marketing it as a daytime staple, a cultural powerhouse. But now it was something else. It was a liability. The data was impossible to ignore. The audience wasn't just losing faith, they were walking away. Ratings had already been sliding, but now the decline wasn't gradual, it was free fall. Inside ABC's headquarters, the mood was shifting. Executives who had once defended Whoopi were suddenly distant. Calls weren't being returned as quickly. Meetings were being held, but not with her. Because while the official statement insisted The View was strong as ever, the internal conversations told a different story. A source inside the network revealed the discussions behind closed doors. They're floating names, potential replacements, new panel lineups. It's not official yet, but it's happening. And Whoopi? She knew. She could feel it every time she stepped on set. The tension, the hesitation, the way producers avoided her eyes, the way Joy Behar seemed a little too careful with her words, the way Karoline's presence still lingered in the air like a ghost they couldn't shake. The View had spent years crushing opposition. It had built its brand on dominance, on control. But now, for the first time, the hosts weren't the ones asking the questions. They were the ones being questioned. And that was the kind of shift that no amount of PR spin could fix. ABC's official statement was predictable. The View remains a vital part of our programming, and we stand by our hosts. Corporate speak for we're buying time. But inside the network, they weren't standing by anyone. The fallout from Karoline Leavitt's appearance wasn't fading, it was deepening. Viewers weren't just questioning The View, they were questioning the entire game. Whoopi knew it. She felt the weight of it every time she walked on set. The audience's reactions, once predictable, once automatic, weren't coming as easily. The applause cues felt forced. The energy in the room had changed. Conversations were being held without her. She could hear the whispers, see the shifts in body language. Something was moving beneath the surface. And Karoline? She was still winning, not just because she had dismantled Whoopi in real time, not just because her words had resonated with millions, but because she had left something behind. A crack, a question, a doubt. The question now wasn't whether Whoopi would survive. It wasn't even whether The View could recover. The real question, the one no one wanted to ask out loud, was this. Had Karoline Leavitt just changed the rules of the game? Because if she had, then Whoopi wasn't the only one in trouble. The entire system was.